Hello everybody, I'm Colin Fogarty, and this is your AP Government Review. So just as a brief overview, in one take, I'm going to try to go over all the content that you're going to need to know for the AP exam. I'm going to cover the cases and a couple of the foundational documents that are not covered in this content. So without further ado, let's get started. I got my script right here, I got my Constitution, I got my Bill of Rights. So let's try to get this thing done. So we're going to start with introducing government in America, and what you need to understand are the core principles of what government does. It maintains national defense, which means you have an army, you make sure that liberties are defended. If someone tries to attack you, you attack back. You provide public services, whether that's mail in the United States or welfare. You provide something to the public that they need to survive. You preserve order, police, pretty simple. Socialize the young. This is probably the one that's maybe the most confusing. And the best way to think about this is instilling civic values. Think of how in the morning you'll stand up and give the Pledge of Allegiance. That's socializing the young, and that's something that government does. And the last thing is collect taxes. Takes money out of your pocket, puts it towards stuff that helps you. Then how do they do these 5 things? Policy. Now we need to understand what the policy-making process looks like. The first thing is having an issue. So let's say that I want pizza to be the national food of the United States. I need to find a linkage institution, which could be a political party, it could be an election, it could be an interest group, it could be the media. Something that can link what my issue is, making pizza the national food of the United States, to the government. And what these linkage institutions will do is they'll take my issue and they'll put it on the policy agenda. And what the policy agenda decides is what issues the government is going to deal with. And the institutions that are affected by the policy agenda are going to be the legislature, which is the first branch, the executive, which is the second branch, and the judiciary, which is the third branch. However, some people would argue that the bureaucracy is the fourth branch, and we're going to talk about the bureaucracy in depth in this video. Now, if an issue is political, it means that there's 2 different groups that have dueling views on it. So let's say that I want pizza to be the national food of the United States. One group wants pepperoni pizza, and the other group wants cheese pizza. Well, then that issue would become political because you have 2 different views. And now we move on to democratic theory. So traditional democratic theory has 5 principles. Equality in voting, which means one person, one vote. Effective participation, which means I can go and I can actually change something through, whether it's protesting, whether it's volunteering, whether it's voting, I can actually participate and make effective change through that. Enlightened understanding. This is the one that we probably fail on a lot, but it's the principle that you understand the issues and you can make good determinations about how the country should move based on your enlightened understanding. And then you have citizen control of the agenda. And this kind of is going to tie back to that whole linkage institution issue of how the citizens can decide what the government actually is going to legislate on. And this is usually done through elections and mandates and such. And then you have inclusion, which is the theory that everybody has the same rights in a democracy. And until the 1960s, America was failing on that last principle. But what that leaves us with are competing theories of contemporary American democracy. And we have pluralism, elitism, and hyperpluralism. Now, pluralism is the principle that you have all these different factions competing for one policy, that eventually all of these groups are going to have to compromise, which is going to create a policy which is best for everybody. And on the other end of that, you have hyperpluralism, which is the principle that if you have all of these different groups or factions competing, that it's eventually going to inhibit the government from actually making any effective change because all these groups are fighting amongst each other, not actually creating policy. And then on the other spectrum of that, you have elitism, which is the theory that a small group of people have the most amount of power in the United States, whether that's the banks, whether that's the CEOs. It's the principle that the common man doesn't have power, corporations or the elite have power. So, as I'm sure you understand, American democracy kind of sucks. So we kind of understand what are the problems with American democracy. The first one is increased complexity of the issues. Do you understand bankruptcy law? No, you don't. And that's one of the big issues, is that issues in the United States are so complex that small brains like ours can't understand them in totality, so we can't make judgments about them. The other one is limited participation in government. And that's the idea that people don't actually want to participate in elections. They don't want to volunteer. They don't want to be involved in the government, which kind of makes democracy hard. Then you have escalating campaign costs, and we're going to talk about money in elections later on, but all you have to understand is that money is so influential in determining the winner of elections that it's hard to say that we actually control who wins elections in the first place. And then you have diverse political interests, and this is the idea that it's not just 2 groups competing against each other, it's more like 50 different groups, and within those 50 groups you have 50 subgroups. So many people have different political interests that it's hard for anybody to achieve consensus in the United States. But for all the faults that American democracy has, we have certain things which we hold near and dear to our hearts in America, and that's considered to be our political culture. And more specifically, we have these principles: liberty, which is the ability to live in freedom; egalitarianism, which is the everybody is equal. You have individualism, which is the belief that everybody can get ahead on their own, pull up your bootstraps and solve problems for yourself. Laissez-faire, which is free markets. That's something that we pride ourselves in America. And then populism, which is the struggle between the average American Joe and the elite. Something like what Karl Marx wrote about in the Communist Manifesto. Think of it like, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. All right. Now we have the Constitution. Because we've introduced America, we can talk about the Constitution, which is our founding document. But first, we need to talk about the Articles of Confederation. So basically, the AOC, not that AOC, created a unicameral legislature which was led by the states, in which each state had a vote. But the AOC was a major L. Both AOCs. And because it had limited powers, it had limited funds, it had limited attendance, limited power over commerce, basically the states could decide how to trade, not the national government. So overall, you had an incredibly weak government under the Articles of Confederation. And because the Articles of Confederation sucked so much, there's this guy named Shea in Massachusetts that said, all right, I'm about to rebel. Because he was very fed up with how the economy was performing under the Articles of Confederation. And because the Articles of Confederation prevented any national government from putting down this uprising, it led landowners to actually hiring a private militia to put down the uprising. So eventually everybody said, okay, Articles of Confederation really suck. They're not working for us. It's a weak national government. Let's try to amend this thing. So everybody goes to Philadelphia and they say, all right, we're going to rewrite this entire document and we're going to create the Constitution. And there's four major philosophies you need to understand that go behind the Constitution. The first one is human nature. And this is all built off of Hobbes' view in Leviathan that we all act in self-interest. So the principle is that government has to control the fact that people act in their self-interest. The next one is political conflict. And this is the idea that the distribution of wealth in any society leads to political conflict between factions, so the government has to check those factions. Then it's the purpose of government. And in general, delegates at the convention believed that government was to protect property. It's basically what John Locke talked about in his second essay on government. And then you have the nature of government. And basically, it was the idea that power should be set against power. And this is going to manifest itself in the principle of checks and balances. And those are the four major philosophies that go behind the Constitution as a document. But now we need to understand some of the issues that were debated at the convention. So we had the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan. Population versus equality. It was the idea of when you build a legislature, are you going to have it based on how many people each state has, or have an equality in voting? So every state has the same amount of votes. Now remember, under the Articles of Confederation, everybody had one vote. But eventually they reached something called the Connecticut Compromise, or the Connecticut plan. So it was the idea that you'll have a Senate, which is equality in voting, and then you'll have a House, which is based on population. And because the Senate has the power to ratify treaties, confirm appointments, and try impeachment, it's important that it has that equality so everybody has equal say. The smaller states can have as much say in those important functions of government as the bigger states. And then a big issue was slavery. And so basically what southern states said is, okay, we want to be able to count slaves for the purpose of determining political representation in the House. And the North said no, because not necessarily because it was slavery, but because it would disenfranchise them from political power. So the 3/5 compromise was reached so that every slave would count for 3/5 of a normal person. It's a horrible thing, but it was the only way that they could get the Constitution passed. Then you had equality in voting. And so there was a question over whether there should be universal suffrage for white men. So up until that point, you had to usually own land in order to vote. So there was the issue of whether every man should be able to vote, whether or not he owns land. But eventually the delegates at the convention said, all right, we're just going to leave that one to the states. Then you had economic issues. Most of the delegates decided to strengthen national economic power. They decided that the government should have the ability to provide innovation in the markets, to allow markets to flourish by allowing roads, issuing patents, punishing counterfeit, and prohibiting the states from making their own currency, and allowing them to inhibit and preventing the states from inhibiting economic development. That is to stop economic development from taking place by not allowing them to make their own currency or placing duties or imports, basically inhibiting trade. All of those things are going to be controlled by the national government in order to ensure that the economic prowess of the United States can take off. And then you had the issue of individual rights. And many delegates at the convention believed that states could adequately protect rights. So in the Constitution itself, not necessarily Bill of Rights, but in the Constitution itself, there are only the following protections on individual liberty. You had protections against the suspension of habeas corpus, passing bills of attainder, which basically allows someone to be put into jail without a trial, ex post facto laws, which are laws that punish prior behavior. Let's say that I break this mug, and then Congress passes a law saying that breaking mugs is illegal. If I get punished for breaking this mug before that law is passed, it would be considered an ex post facto law. But the Constitution protects me from being tried by that law that was passed, because you can't try something that's ex post facto. And then there were no religious qualifications for office, and there were strict rules for evidence in treason cases, and you can find that in Article 3. And so all of these powers, all of these issues, all of these philosophies, they go into making the Madisonian form of government that we have today under the Constitution, which limited majority control. The only element that is technically in the control of the majority is the House, the House of Representatives in Congress. It separates powers. Basically, each branch of government has its own powers, and you'll learn about that later on down the road in this video. It checks and balances. We all know that. The idea that the Senate holds a certain power which checks the president, that the president has a power which checks the Congress, that the Supreme Court can check the Congress and can check the executive. Basically, each branch of government has a certain role or purpose which allows it to stop the other branch of government from exercising tyranny. And then establishing a federal system. And federalism we'll get to in the next part of the video, but basically you need to know that you have a national government and a state government, and they share powers and have spheres of influence that are separate and sometimes merged. And then lastly, we have to discuss the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists supported a strong national government, and they supported the Constitution. And the Anti-Federalists were like, no, I want a state government. I want more of a confederacy. And eventually, the Anti-Federalists came to an agreement with the Federalists. If the Federalists would pass a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, then the Anti-Federalists would allow the Constitution to pass. And that's eventually how we get the Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, like a year after the Constitution gets ratified by the states. So that leaves us with the Constitution, all those philosophies, the Madisonian form of government, all those issues that were debated. But the question still remains, what if I wanted to change the Constitution? Well, a formal change requires 2/3 of vote from each house of Congress and 3/4 of the states. And that's very hard to do. That's why it's only been done 27 times. And we've had a lot of proposed amendments. So we need to talk about informal changes. That's something that can be done to the Constitution. You can have judicial interpretation, political practice, technology, or the increasing demands of policy. And you'll kind of see how each of these ones play out, whether it's through the court cases or things like social welfare, right? That's not in the Constitution itself, but the increasing demands of policy allow for the exercise of the necessary and proper clause to allow government to, be flexible. And that's why we consider the Constitution to be a living document. All right. So now that we have the Constitution, we need to add something else to the government soup: federalism. Now, federalism is shared power between 2 or more levels of government, and you should know that only 11 nations in the world actually use a federal system, and it's opposed to a unitary form of government or a confederal form of government. A unitary form of government is where all the power is invested in a national government, and a confederacy is where you have a bunch of weaker, smaller governments that have their own spheres of influence kind of coming together to establish some national regulation. And a federal system is right between a unitary or a confederal system. Why is it? Well, I guess the question is, why is a federal system good? Well, one, it decentralizes politics. More people have power and more people can enter politics, right? Whether it's through the local, state, or national government, you have more opportunities to become part of the policy-making system. It enhances judicial power, and this is probably one of the more interesting things about the federal system. The states can act as policy innovators. This is another important aspect of the federal system, because states usually can take on a lot of policy that the federal government cannot. They're allowed to innovate on that policy, and that's going to follow through with Jefferson's theory of states as a laboratory of democracy. And then states are going to handle social, family, and moral issues. And this is one of the advantages of a federal system, because if you think about it, issues related to the family, issues related to morality, and social issues are the ones that are often the most divisive. So allowing states to implement their own, their own rules among 50 different states is better than, a national regulation which may be opposed by a large faction of Americans. So how does federalism work in the United States? Well, the Constitution makes states responsible for elections, and elections are obviously the biggest part of the government, so it's important that states exercise control in that realm. And then you have the 10th Amendment, which gives states power over policy, which Congress does not have the authority under in Article 2. And this basically allows states to legislate on anything which Congress does not explicitly have the power to legislate on, and this is what increases the power of the federal system. Then you have the Supremacy Clause, which is going to make federal law supreme to the states. But let's look at how other clauses in the Constitution play out. First, we have the Necessary and Proper Clause, and in McCulloch v. Maryland, which we'll talk about later on down the road, it basically establishes federal supremacy and that you can use the Necessary and Proper Clause to take another enumerated power within Article 2 and say that it is necessary and proper to do X to execute Y, Y being the enumerated power within Article 2. Then you have the Commerce Clause, which is going to give Congress the ability to regulate almost all commercial activity, which was affirmed in Gibbons v. Ogden, and for the longest time, Congress basically had power over anything related to commerce as long as it was not commerce happening only within a state, but it was eventually going to be curtailed by U.S. v. Lopez, which we'll talk about later on down the road. And then the Civil War is going to settle this issue of national supremacy, because even though the Supremacy Clause exists and is affirmed in McCulloch v. Maryland, you still have issues of states' rights, and so until the Civil War, states' rights was still a big issue in American politics. And then the Civil War happened, and everybody kind of agreed, all right, the national government is superior to the state governments. But the struggle for racial equality back in the 1960s is what's going to, re-inflame this issue of federalism and where the federal government is actually supreme. And then we also need to talk about states' obligations to each other under a federal system. So one, full faith and credit. That's basically recognizing all public records. That's why, if I got pulled over in Kentucky 2 weekends ago, I could show them my Virginia driver's license, and Kentucky would have to recognize that as a legitimate license. Extradition. Basically, let's say that I commit a crime in Kentucky and I go to Virginia. Well, then Virginia has the obligation to extradite me, means send me back to Kentucky to stand trial there. And then privileges and immunities. It basically means that whether I'm in Kentucky or I'm in Virginia, I will be protected equally by the state. But, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court of the United States has never actually fully defined what privileges and immunities actually means in the sense of the law. So now we need to go over some major concepts of federalism in America. Dual federalism is the principle that there's a clear separation of powers. You can think of it as a sheet cake. And then on the other side, you have cooperative federalism. And this is the principle that states and the federal government are going to share certain powers. And you can envision it sort of like a marble cake where, there's not a clear definition of who's got what, but everybody's got a little bit of something. And then you have devolution or de-evolution, however you choose to pronounce it. And that's the principle mainly led by Republicans that federal powers should be transferred to the states. And what this means is that, let's say the federal government has power over X. Well, then Congress would say, all right, we're going to remove this regulation and we're going to leave it to the states to decide how to do it. And then you have fiscal federalism, and this is basically how money is spent. So, let's go deeper. Categorical grants versus block grants. And because everybody cares about money, we really need to understand these. Categorical grants are specific grants with specific purposes, with specific regulations over how you can spend that money. And there's two ways you can get a categorical grant. You can get it through a project grant, which is you apply and you get it based on a project that you want to do, or formula grants, which is basically the government plugs a bunch of numbers into a supercomputer, and that supercomputer says you should have X amount of money. On the other end of that, we have block grants, which are just automatic funds, which are given to the states, and which they have discretionary funding over, so they are less strings attached. You can basically spend that money however you see fit. Then you have crossover sanctions, which is basically when the federal government is going to use, whether it's a block grant or a categorical grant, typically a block grant, to influence policy. They'll say, all right, we're going to withhold this grant from you unless you do X, Y, or Z. And then if you do X, Y, or Z, we'll give that block grant to you, and that's known as crossover sanctions. Now, the principle of universalism in the federal system that we have in the United States basically means that funds should be distributed as equally as possible. Now, obviously, New Hampshire is not going to get the same amount of money as California, but they should have equal opportunity to get the same amount of funding. New Hampshire shouldn't just get less money because it's a small state, and California get more money because it's a big state. And then we need to talk about mandates. And mandates are basically when the federal government wants the states and localities to provide additional funding under the threat of having, fiscal sanctions. Basically, you might not get the money unless you do X, Y, or Z. This is sort of similar to crossover sanctions, but one of the key things about mandates is that you can have unfunded mandates, which basically means the state and local government have to fund it all on their own, which creates more problems because oftentimes states and localities don't have enough money on their own to fund them. All right, so now that we've got the Constitution and federalism out of our way, we can start talking about the branches of government. The first one we're going to talk about is Congress. 535 members, 100 senators, 435 members of the House of Representatives. Let's say I want to be a member of the House of Representatives. What do I have to be? Well, I need to be 25 years old, and I need to be a citizen for 7 years. Let's say I want to be a senator. You need to be 30 years old and a citizen for 9 years. As you can tell, the founders basically wanted the Senate to be older and smarter and wiser. And they failed at doing that. But first, we need to understand some elections, all right? So I want to be a House member. I want to be a senator. How do I get elected? Well, typically it's going to be hard for me to get elected unless I'm an incumbent, because incumbents typically win with 60+% of the vote because it has its advantages. If I'm an incumbent, I have a lot of time spent in districts advertising. You know, I can claim credit for policy that's helped the district. I can take positions, basically say like, this is a big issue in America, it's a big national security crisis, this is a big economic crisis, here's where I stand, and here's how you know where I stand, because I'm actually facing these issues head on. And this kind of ties into that credit claiming part. And then typically incumbents face weak opponents, and they have more money to spend because they spend all of their 2-year term fundraising, right? If you actually go and you look at how congressmen fundraise, typically their schedule has 4 hours they'll be doing office work for the House of Representatives, and then they'll spend 3 hours sitting in a cubicle raising money on the phone. That's literally what it is to be a congressman, and because they're able to raise that much money, they're usually able to beat incumbents. But let's say I'm an incumbent and I had a scandal, or there was a redistricting, or there was a tidal wave, #BlueWave 2020. What does that mean? Well, that means that I will typically lose my seat to a challenger. But lots of incumbents, typically they win. They have lots of knowledge of Congress, which typically makes them very entrenched in Congress, but also more knowledgeable about how to be a congressman. So there's advantages and there's disadvantages to being an incumbent, both in elections and then how you're able to act in Congress once you take your office. So now that we understand how to get elected and we understand what senators and what House of Representatives members are, how does Congress work? Well, first of all, we need to understand it's bicameral. You have the Senate and you have the House. Going back, that's created by the Connecticut Compromise. The House is more centralized, has a more hierarchy, has party line voting, and the House Rules Committee, which is chaired by the Speaker of the House, basically controls everything. It's a lot different in the Senate. The Senate's less disciplined, and party leaders basically negotiate when things are going to be voted on, and, most importantly, there's a thing called the filibuster, in which debate can go on forever, forever, on a piece of legislation, and a vote can never be held. And this can be done through either a speaking filibuster or silent filibuster. A speaking filibuster is when you get up there and you actually start speaking for 24 hours, 26 hours. I think the record at this time is 26 hours. And then the Senate is not able to vote. Or you have a silent filibuster in which you have enough people refuse to vote for a cloture motion, which ends debate and allows a vote to proceed on a piece of legislation in the Senate. Because you need 60 votes to reach cloture, if you can just get 41 people to not vote to oppose cloture, then you will not have achieved the 60 vote threshold to pass a cloture motion and move on to actually vote on whether to pass the bill, which will allow debate to go on to indefinitely, and that's known as a silent filibuster. So most of these houses, whether it's the House of Representatives or it's the Senate, are going to need leaders. So how do they work? In the House, you have the Speaker of the House, which is elected by everybody at the beginning of the congressional term. So I believe Nancy Pelosi is our current Speaker of the House, and she was elected. Then you have the Majority Leader, the Majority Whip, and what the Majority Leader does is basically whatever the Speaker says, but the Majority Whip goes around and counts votes, and they basically make sure that you're voting for what bills you need to vote for, and that the party leaders have enough votes to pass a piece of legislation. Because how embarrassing would it be if you're like, all right, we're going to vote on this major piece of legislation, and then everybody's like, hey man, I'm not actually going to vote for it. I mean, that'd be pretty bad. And that's why whips exist, to make sure that you're actually voting. And on the other end, the minority party in the House of Representatives has a minority leader and a minority whip. And for the most part, the minority leader is just there to act as a spokesperson for the minority party because they don't hold that much power. It's a lot different in the Senate because obviously majority leaders and majority whips, they corral votes and everything, but the minority leader in the Senate has more power to influence policy because of one, less people, and two, the fact that debate can go on forever. So a minority leader can corral votes to oppose a cloture motion, going back to that filibuster issue, to ensure that there's never actually a vote on a piece of legislation. Now we have to talk about committees, because Congress is not just one body debating in one big room. It mainly gets done in committees. So you have standing committees, and they're going to handle specific policy, and they're going to handle oversight, which is hearings, basically saying, I want to hear so-and-so official talk about this policy to make sure that it's actually going well. Then you have joint committees, which have membership between the House and the Senate, and there are only like 4 joint committees currently. Then you have conference committees, and these basically are made up of both the Senate and the House, but they come together to decide how to reconcile a piece of legislation. Let's say the House passes version X of a bill, and the Senate passes version Y. You will call a conference committee to decide how to get version X and version Y to be similar enough to be one bill, which will then be voted on again by each house and then sent to the president to be signed or vetoed. And that's what a conference committee does. Then you have select committees, and these are going to handle special topics for a short time, the most infamous of which, in my opinion, is the House Special Select Committee on Benghazi. Look it up. It's absolutely fascinating to read about the politics that went behind this. And then, let's say I want to get on a committee. How do I get on a committee? Well, one, you should understand that the leadership within Congress typically honors requests to the best of their ability, but loyalty is the most important aspect in getting on a committee. But let's say I want to chair a committee. That basically means you can control how the committee functions. Up until around the 1970s, the seniority system was used, in which whoever was the most old person in Congress got the chairmanship. But when in the 1970s, younger members of Congress decided to revolt against that, it typically became based both on merit and seniority. So seniority is less of the rule and more of just a general guideline, whereas merit and dedication to that policy topic usually indicates who should be the chair. And then we should understand that there's caucuses. So not only are there committees, but there's caucuses. And caucuses are not official policy-oriented groups, but they're just people that have a common interest. And these are typically bipartisan groups. There's caucuses about the Chesapeake Bay. There's caucuses about issues like autism. There's caucuses about issues like marijuana, right? Every issue in America, there's probably a caucus about. And there's also caucuses based on race, right? Black people in Congress all have a caucus together in which they decide how to advance the interest of African Americans in Congress. And then last thing you should understand about Congress is congressional staff. So there's about 17 personal staff members for a member of the House of Representatives and about 40 for a senator. Then you have committee staff. And these committee staff, there's about 2,000 per committee, and they're going to handle legislation. They're going to handle reports. They're also going to handle setting up oversight hearings. And then you have staff agencies. You've got the Congressional Research Service. Basically, let's say I'm a senator. I want to know more about an issue. I submit a request to the CRS, and they say, here's a report about whatever topic you want to know about. You have the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. They basically say, here's what the budget is doing to our economy, whether it's good, whether it's bad. Let's say I have a tax-related bill. They can do an analysis of its economic impact. And then you have the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office. They basically look at past programs and say, here's the effects, here's what to do to improve it. And they basically are used as a in-house kind of government watchdog. And that's done with Congress. So now we can talk about the presidency. Most presidents run for election, but 1 in 5 presidents have attained the presidency through a succession. That's meaning that the president died or became incapacitated or resigned, so now the vice president takes over. Presidential powers overview. So the Constitution creates a system in which the president must obtain the support of officials to enact his policy. And whether that's the officials within his bureaucracy or that's the officials in Congress, he has to get their consent to move forward his power or move forward his objectives. In the 50s and 60s, people wanted a stronger president. In the 70s, they wanted a weaker president, and that kind of continued on into the 90s. But when George W. Bush took office and 9/11 took place, in the advent of technology, the leading role of the president has increased their power tremendously, as well as the vice president. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. So the president has multiple roles. The chief executive, leader, the commander-in-chief, the leader of Congress, the chief legislator, and then the chief of the people. So let's first understand the president as the chief executive. And what this means is that he is the person in charge of running the government. So he has to run the government mainly by appointing administrators to run his bureaucracy. He has a VP to run the Senate, And up until Dick Cheney was the vice president of the United States, the vice president was typically an unimportant job. It was mainly just to ensure that you could get a certain amount of votes in the election. But once Dick Cheney took office as vice president, he was able to dramatically expand the powers of the vice president, which has created a more powerful vice president today. Then you have White House staff. They basically determine your role based on loyalty. Loyalty is the most important thing if you are a White House staffer. Then you can have either a hierarchy in which the president is at top, and then you have the chief of staff, and then you have multiple advisors until you have the lowest of the lows in the White House staff, or you can have a spoken wheel model in which the president or the chief of staff is the center, and then different people can have a decentralized process in which they handle policy for the White House. Then you have the most important aspect of the bureaucracy in the sense of the bureaucracy in the sense of how the president runs it, which is the cabinet. And it's not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but it was created under Washington, and now it has 14 secretaries handling 14 departments of varying difference. Then you have the Executive Office, and this has three important policy-making bodies. You have the National Security Council. They're going to handle, as their name implies, national security. You have the Council of Economic Advisors. They're going to handle national economic policy for the president. And then you have the Office of Management and Budget, and they're going to basically be in charge of preparing a budget to send to Congress, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now we need to understand the president as the chief legislator and his leadership in Congress. So as the chief legislator, the president has the ability to veto bills directly or pocket veto. And this is when I get a bill and I don't do any action, I don't do anything to it, I don't sign it into law, or I don't veto it, but Congress is going to adjourn before it will automatically become law, in which it becomes vetoed and the Congress cannot overturn it. And then there are times in which the president doesn't want to veto a bill, but they also don't want to enforce it. So what they will do is they will sign the bill into law, and then they will make a public statement in which they say, Section X, Y, or Z of today's legislation that I signed, I will not be enforcing because I don't agree with it. And then you have the president as a party leader. So basically, the president needs the support of Congress, more specifically his party, to get any sort of policy accomplished in Congress. And so one of the things that motivates party leader or party fidelity to the president is collective stake, right? Whatever the president believes in, congressmen typically believe in too, and so there's a collective stake that their desires for public policy are all intertwined. But then you have slippage in party support due to the diversity in opinions and diversity of constituencies, right? Understand that congressmen have to represent the interests of their constituencies. So when the interest of an individual constituency conflicts with the interest of the president, even if that congressperson and the president are from the same party, that can usually cause a divergence in support between the president and the member of Congress. And then there's the need to maintain public support for your initiatives to increase the chances that Congress will go along with it, right? If you can go to Congress and say, hey guys, look, people care about my policy initiatives, you should care about them too, it's much easier to get policy done. And then presidents have to have good legislative skills, right? So not only do you have to have public support, not only do you have to have the support of your party in Congress, but you also have to have the skills to get policy done. And this can be done through bargaining, sending bills to Congress earlier on in your term when you can benefit from that honeymoon period, and it's easier to get your initiatives passed. Now we need to understand the president as the commander-in-chief, the leader of national security policy. So as chief diplomat, which is in that same realm, the president has the ability to enter into executive agreements without the Senate's consent, but if the president wants to enter into a treaty with another nation, he needs 2/3 of the Senate to approve that treaty. And then as commander-in-chief, the president has the ability to make short-term deployments without Congress, but for the most part, Congress has tried to curtail the president's power as commander-in-chief. But it's also important to note that the president has basically ignored Congress, and the AUMF authorization of use of military force has basically been extended since 2001. So the biggest thing to understand is that Congress usually accedes or allows the president to have virtually unlimited power in the realm of national security, And this is a constant whether it's a Democrat or Republican in office. And then you have presidents as crisis managers. And because most crises in the world happen in the realm of foreign policy, Congress usually allows the president to respond however they see fit. And the biggest thing to understand is that while the president creates policy in the realm of foreign affairs, Congress does not implement it, but just oversees it, right? Congress is the one that says, hey, explain to me what's going on here so we can conduct oversight, not actually pass legislation in the world of foreign affairs. And then we have to understand how the president gets his power from the people. So one of the big things is that the White House basically choreographs how the president acts from sunup to sundown through the Office of Communications. And this means carefully coordinated events in order to boost public opinion. And then there's a strong need for public support because going back to that leadership in Congress issue, if you have the public support, it's easier for your initiatives to get passed. Mobilizing the public through the bully pulpit is the number one way that the president can get legislation passed. Now, lastly, we should understand how the president interacts with the press. This is all done through the press secretary who speaks for the administration. But oftentimes, the press's coverage of the president is going to be negative and lacking analysis because there's more of an emphasis on getting the entertainment aspect out rather than doing constructive analysis of how the president is acting. All right, so now that we've talked about Congress and the presidency, let's take a quick break to talk about the budget. Now, the budget allocates money to the government and is probably one of the most contested issues in Congress. And the big thing to know is that a budget deficit is when the amount of money that the government is spending exceeds the amount of money that the government got from taxes. So first, we need to cover revenue and borrowing. So personal and income tax are the major ways that the government raises money. And a tax in the United States on income is progressive, which means if you're earning more income, you're getting taxed more. And if you're earning less income, you're getting taxed less. Now there's social insurance taxes, and these are automatically deducted from your paycheck and are earmarked, meaning that they automatically go to whatever program that they're going for. They're earmarked for Social Security and Medicare. And then you have an issue of borrowing, and this is when the government takes out loans, and this is known as intergovernmental debt. The United States Department of Treasury owes money to foreign governments that it has borrowed for various programs in the United States. And too much debt, or the belief is that too much debt can crowd out investment and makes the United States dependent on other countries. And because of this issue and fear of dependency on other countries and crowding out of investment, the Congress can pass debt ceilings, which limits the amount of money that the United States government can borrow. But these debt ceilings are usually reached very quickly, which means that the Congress continuously has to raise the debt ceiling, never lower it, because of the fear that it could cause an economic crisis. Now, as public policy goes, revenue and borrowing get affected by tax expenditures, which is revenue lost by federal exemptions. So tax exemptions, tax credits are all tax expenditures, which are money that you get back even though it should be going to the government. There are federal exemptions on charity donations, on mortgages, investment, and these are all ways to encourage people to invest in companies, to invest in charity, or make charitable contributions, or to take out mortgages. Tax expenditures create avenues for the government to encourage citizens to take individual policy. However, most of these benefit the upper and middle class and are abused because of their loopholes. And then tax cuts are when you cut the amount of money that's coming into the government in order to, in theory, create more investment, but most of the times they make government bigger because you still need to pay for all those programs, you have less money coming in, and it's kind of ironic. Republicans usually lead the charge for these tax cuts, but it also increases the size of the government, which goes against conservative principles. So now that we understand how we get the money, we should understand what we do with it. So the government spends about 1/3 of its GDP, and our GDP right now is about something in the trillions, something in the billions. It's a lot of money, that. And then there's a growing public sector because people like services from the government. Now, one of the big components of the federal budget was national security, and this was because of the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned about. And up until the end of the Cold War, national security expenditures accounted for about 1/5 of the entire budget. But nowadays, it's social insurance, so income security and welfare that have overtaken the biggest aspects of the budget. Now, the money for Social Security is required, which means that it's an uncontrollable expenditure. That money has to be going. The government has to provide Social Security. It's not an optional thing. And it's the same with Medicaid, because it's an audit, it's a qualification. You qualify for Medicaid and the government gives it to you. And then one of the big things to understand is that Medicaid costs are going to exceed income very soon. So incrementation is the principle that last year's budget is a good indicator for this year's budget, right? If I look at last year's budget, I can see how much money the government spent on different programs, and that's going to be a very good indicator for how the government is going to spend money the next year, because the government doesn't want to make drastic changes to the budget, it really wants to make incremental changes. So now that we understand how we get the money, how it's spent, we need to understand how we got from the point where we got that money, so we took our taxes and then spent the taxes, and that's the budgetary process. So here are all the different aspects of budgetary politics. You have interest groups, you have federal agencies that want money for their own programs. You have the Office of Management and Budget, which basically has to jockey between what the president wants, what Congress wants, and what those federal agencies want. You have the president, who has very specific policy initiatives. You have the tax committee in the House of Representatives, because all tax legislation must start in the House of Representatives, which says, I want to increase or decrease taxes. Then you have the Congressional Budget Office, which basically takes what the budget is supposed to be and does an economic analysis of it. Then you have the Authorization Committee, and you have the Appropriations Committee. So the Authorization Committee basically allows programs to be created, and the Appropriation Committee basically says, here's the money that goes to those programs. And you have the Government Accountability Office, which determines whether a program was actually functioning the previous year. And all of these different groups come together to create the budget, because they're all jockeying for different needs, right? Federal agencies want to increase the amount of money that they have, but the tax committee might want to, or the appropriations committee might want to decrease the amount of money that's being spent in the federal government overall. So the president's budget is submitted on February 1st, and the summer before February 1st, the policies are decided. In the fall, agencies submit their recommendations to the Office of Management and Budget, and in the winter before February 1st, that budget is all prepared and then is submitted to Congress. Now, 3 other things we need to understand about the budget before we move on. A budget resolution is going to bind expenditure levels. Reconciliation is when programs are revised to meet savings needs or tax adjustments. And then authorization is what establishes or changes a government program. And these are all different ways that Congress exercises control over the budget, because it is Congress that passes budget resolutions, authorizations, and reconciliations. And that's going to do it for the budget. So now we can talk about the bureaucracy, which I would consider to be the fourth branch of government under the presidency, but equally is independent. So first, who are the bureaucrats? So up until, say, the 1800s, you had the patronage system, which is basically you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Political favors were rewarded by political positions. Now this changed with the implementation of the civil service program and the merit principle, which basically says it doesn't matter how loyal you are, but how well you can do your job, which determines whether or not you should move on. Now, the Office of Personnel and Management is going to handle employment, and they give out general standard ratings, and these basically determine your benefits and your pay as a government employee. And there are about 500 top political appointments, think of like secretaries and ambassadorships, and you have 2,500 lesser political appointments. These are still ones that the president nominates and the Senate confirms, but they're less important. And then you have the government of strangers, which is basically the principle that every time a new president is elected, the entire political class within the bureaucracy gets replaced, which creates a government of people that are not familiar with how bureaucracy functions and are not familiar with how the bureaucracy was functioning before they took that place. And what this research has concluded is that career civil servants are more effective at running federal agencies than political appointees. Now we can talk about the bureaucracy itself. Now there are departments, independent regulatory commissions, government corporations, and independent executive agencies. And these 4 different types of institutions make up the bureaucracy. Now, departments are going to handle the big policy. You've got, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of the Treasury, Department of Justice, Department of the Interior, Department of Education, and so on and so forth. Then you have the independent regulatory commissions. Now, these are going to be responsible for making and enforcing the rules to protect the public. Think of the FTC, the FEC, the SEC, commissions like that, which create rules, have hearings, and determine regulations for the private sector. Now, rulemaking by these independent regulatory commissions is of much interest to interest groups, which believe that they can influence policy here, which may help their own cause. And another big thing to understand about these regulatory commissions is that the regulators often come from the regulated. Take Ajit Pai, who is the administrator of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. He was once a tech at Verizon, and so he was originally regulated by the FCC, but now he runs the FCC, and that's the principle of the regulators coming from the regulated. Now, next you have government corporations, and these are going to basically be when the government provides a service that can be handled by the private sector. Think of the U.S. Postal Service or Amtrak, right? These are government corporations. These are services that typically are provided by the private sector, but are now offered by the public sector. And then you have independent executive agencies, and they're everything else that is not a regulatory commission, not a department, not a federal agency under a department, or government corporation. So think of NASA or the General Services Administration, which handles, I need to replace the lights in my office, right? That's what the General Services Administration does. Now, once the bureaucracy makes a rule, it has to be implemented. Now, there are 3 elements of implementation. The first one is creation of a new agency or new assignment. Basically, hey, I have a rule to make sure that pepperonis on pizza are only 2 inches wide, right? I need to create a new agency in the Department of Justice to enforce that, which will be the Federal Pizza Administration, right? Then you have to translate the policy goals of legislation into operational goals and guidelines. And then you have to coordinate resources. Now, implementation usually fails for lots of reasons. The first one is faulty program design. I'll give you an example. Back in the early 2010s, the ATF decided to sell firearms to Mexican cartels in order to track them. So what they did is they went to Radio Shack and they got GPS devices. They built them and put them into the handles of assault rifles. Now, one of the only issues is that the materials from Radio Shack would not be able to work once you got out of like 500 miles or 500 yards of whoever was trying to track the gun. And so eventually the ATF lost track of all the weapons that had sold to the Mexican cartel. That would be faulty program design leading to a failure of implementation. You have lack of clarity, which is when Congress makes broad policies, whether it's to escape blame if the policy fails or claim credit if the policy is good, but the bureaucracy says, hey, I don't know how to implement this because they don't actually know what they're supposed to do. Or you have a lack of resources because there's not enough staff, there's not enough equipment, there's not enough money, or there's not enough authority within the federal bureaucracy to actually carry out a regulation or a law that's been passed by Congress. So most bureaucrats will end up following standard operating procedures, which are basically, if X happens, then you do Y. And these make sure that there are, clarity and uniformity in government. But administrators often have administrator disposition, which is basically the theory that they have the discretion to act outside of standard operating procedures when the time calls for it to adapt. And then you have implementation also being hampered by fragmentation, which is when too many agencies have to handle one issue. Think of nuclear proliferation. You had like 86 or 96 separate federal agencies or departments handling nuclear policy. And fragmentation makes it difficult because instead of having one agency handling all of it, you have to coordinate with 95 other agencies to handle one policy. Nuclear power. And that's just a good example of it. And this leads to decentralized implementation and often creates problems for it. Now, because of all this, because of all the problems with implementation, it's often to privatize elements of the bureaucracy. Now, this originally started in the 1980s to promote innovation, but these privatized services often have less scrutiny, and research has shown that they don't actually promote any more innovation and can cause more harm. Look at private prisons, for example. They're worse than federal prisons, and they don't innovate, and we lose money, and they're horrible. So we should get rid of them. Call your congressperson. Now, bureaucracy's main mission is to regulate, meaning they have the control of private sector practices. Now, they're going to need rules and enforcement, whether it's in court or in person, right? You can either take a company to court, the SEC can take a person to court for insider trading, or the Department of Health and Human Services can send out people to, the USDA can send out, people to food plants to say, hey, you're not meeting these regulations, and that's the enforcement aspect after the rulemaking. Now, if they can make rules, they can also take away those rules, and that's known as deregulation, because a lot of times Republicans don't want to see regulation, so they try to have agencies deregulate. because oftentimes one of the big criticisms of regulation is that they raise prices and they can hurt competitiveness, and they fail to actually work in a way that protects consumers. So now that we've covered the bureaucracy, we can move on to the third branch of government, which is the judiciary. Yes, I know I went out of order. I know I went 1, 2, 4, 3, but this is AP government. Nothing makes sense. In the United States, we have an adversarial system, which means two sides compete against each other, and through that, the truth will come out. And you have two types of cases: criminal cases, which are the state versus a person, or civil cases, which are a person versus another person that don't involve crimes. Now, within these cases, there are litigants who are the parties bringing the case. You have the plaintiff who brings the case, and you have the defendant who responds to the case. Now, there's also class action lawsuits in which a group of people come together and they bring suit against a company or an administration or something like that because they've all been harmed in the same way. In all suits, litigants have to have the standing to sue, which means that they actually have the right to be in that court to sue. They've actually been hurt, and that a dispute that they're bringing to these courts must be judiciable, which means that I can actually solve it through legal means, right? Let's say that my friend Tanner takes my computer, right? I could sue him in small claims court, but I would not have standing to sue, or it would not be justiciable because the court can't do anything. They can't really order Tanner to buy me a new laptop. They just don't have the authority to do that, and therefore I cannot sue Tanner in small claims court. Attorneys are the other aspect of the adversarial system, and what they do is they argue on your behalf. And then groups like to use courts to influence policy. ACLU and the NAACP are two groups that are well known for using courts to advance their respective policy goals. Now we can talk about the structure of the federal system. Now, while the Constitution only creates the Supreme Court, it leaves it up to Congress to figure out, first of all, how many people are in the Supreme Court, and then create all of the courts that are below the Supreme Court. And this leads to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which creates the first constitutional courts. Now, Congress can also make legislative courts in addition to constitutional courts, which are made for special purposes, and the judges that serve in them actually have fixed terms instead of life terms. Now, there's the Court of Federal Claims and Tax Court, just as an example. Now, some courts have original jurisdiction, which means they can actually hear the case first, and then other courts have appellate jurisdiction, meaning that if I want to raise an issue about a previous court's ruling, I can take it to that court, and they will review what the district court typically did. So first, we have district courts. There are 91 district courts with 2 to 28 judges, federal judges at those courts. They mainly handle federal crimes, civil suits, bankruptcy, review of actions by federal agencies, admiralty cases, and naturalization. Now, each U.S. District Court has a U.S. Attorney, which is appointed or nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Now, in addition to U.S. attorneys, there's also the Solicitor General, which is not supposed to be in any particular court, but represents the United States government when the United States government is being sued, or when the United States government has a special case being brought in, say, a court of appeals or in the U.S. Supreme Court. Next, we have courts of appeals. Now, there are 12 judicial circuits, and they all have 3 panel judges, unless you have a panel sitting en banc, which means every judge at that court of appeals sits and hears a case. Now, appellate courts can review cases. So let's say that I disagree with a judge's actions in a district court case. I can appeal that to the appellate court. And then they also have the power to enforce orders of regulatory commissions and, like I said earlier, review actions by lower courts. And then lastly, you have the Supreme Court, which is the final court of appeal. It's made up of 9 justices, which was determined by the Congress, of which one is the Chief Justice, and all the other 8 justices are associate justices. Their job is to enforce the uniformity in the law, and most of the times they don't have original jurisdiction over these cases, so they have appellate jurisdiction, but they practice a very strict appellate jurisdiction. They only hear like 80 cases a year, even though there's like 8,000 that get submitted to them, and they'll only hear cases if they pose a substantive federal issue, right? Mainly the Supreme Court determines its own docket and is really only there to settle the biggest issues in the law in that time. Now that we've talked about the structure of the federal courts, we should talk about the courts as a policy-making institution. Now, justices don't actually work themselves. They have a small army of law clerks which do work for them, whether it's creating briefs or doing research for them. And then the justices will read these briefs, and then they'll hear oral arguments, and then they'll decide, whether or not they want to issue an opinion in favor of the appellant or the appellee. Now, there are majority opinions, dissenting opinions, and concurrent opinions. A majority opinion is what the majority of justices believe the case should be ruled as. A concurrent opinion is, I agree with the majority's ruling, whether they rule for the appellant or the appellee, but I agree for separate reasons. And a dissenting opinion is, I don't agree with how the majority is ruling. Most justices, however, are going to adhere to the principle of stare decisis, which is basically whatever the lower courts decided, I'm going to listen to it. It is what makes courts rely on precedent instead of their own opinions, which would be considered to be the attitudinal view, in which justices make decisions based on the outcomes they want to see. Most justices do not follow that. Some judges will, but most justices do not. They listen to precedent. However, courts can also overrule themselves. They don't have to listen to stare decisis all the time. Brown v. Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, and by extension, the Dred Scott decision, right? Courts do not have to follow all of the previous decisions, especially the Supreme Court, which can determine what the Constitution actually says. Now, sometimes judicial power becomes restrained by the theory of originalism, which is practiced by conservative justices. Now, originalism basically says that there should be a strict reading of the Constitution, and there are two types of originalism. You have original intent and then original meaning. Now, original intent is, what did the drafters or the founding fathers intend for this document to do? Or you have original meaning, which is, what would a reasonable person of the time believe the Constitution means? And both of these help limit judicial activism by practicing judicial restraint. So now we can talk about some historic courts before we move on. The Nine Old Men Court happened, it was going to be around the 1930s, and they're going to strike down most of the New Deal policies, which is going to lead Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president at that time, to try to stack the court, or pack the court, however you want to use that word. Then you have the Warren Court, and they're going to expand criminal defendant rights and prohibit public prayers. You're going to have the Burger Court that comes after them. They're going to restrict criminal defendant rights, but they're also going to extend busing and abortion rights. And then you have the Rehnquist and Roberts courts, and they're going to limit rights established by previous decisions in the Burger and Warren Court, and they're also going to constrain the federal power over the states. All right, so now that we're done with the branches of government, we can talk about the people with which the government is supposed to serve by explaining public opinion and political action. So first, we should understand the American people. We're generally an immigrant society. We had three distinct waves of immigration. The first wave was English, Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians. After that, we had the waves in the late 1800s of Italians, Jews, Poles, and Russians. And nowadays, we're going through our third wave of immigration, in which we have a lot of Hispanics and Asians. And this is going to lead to the minority majority, in which minority groups create the majority of the population. Some things to note about the minorities in the United States. Hispanics are going to replace blacks as the largest minority in the United States, and while Asians are going to form the new business class in the United States. They're going to take the role of, traditionally held by white people in the upper middle class. And the worst off minority in the United States is Native Americans. Another thing to note is that America is getting generally older, right? The vast majority of Americans are older than 65, and that number is only increasing with baby boomers all hitting retirement. So now we can talk about political socialization, which is how we establish our political opinions. Now, there are three main avenues for political socialization. You have the family, you have the school, and you have mass media. So family, basically, your family says this is what you should believe. School, you study topics and decide, whether or not you agree with certain actions. And then the mass media basically says, this is what you should believe. They introduce you to new ideas, and they allow you to form public, opinions of your own. Now, over time, political participation is going to increase as it correlates to age. So, it's great that we have all these attitudes, but how can we measure them? Now, the answer is polling. Now, polls are conducted with a sample of the population, around 1,000 to 1,500 people, and there has to be random sampling, means everybody has the equal probability of being selected for the poll. Now, because polls can't be perfect, there's something called sampling error, which is the relative confidence of the poll that has been conducted. Now, the average sampling error is plus or minus 3%, which means that 95% of the time, the poll results are going to be within 3% of the total population. So the higher you have, the higher your sampling error is, the lower, the less trustworthy that poll actually is. And then most polling is going to be done through the phones with random dialing, but over time, the affordability of phone polling has gone down, meaning that phone polling is becoming harder to conduct. Now, what is the role of polls within democracy? Well, understand that polls can help politicians direct policy and detect public preferences. However, some people criticize this and basically say that because of polls, politicians only do certain things because it's going to boost their numbers in the polls. Polls can also be used to locate keywords and phrases for speeches, right? If you go back to the early 2000s, you can understand that things like climate change and global warming were created by Republicans through through focus group polling to decide what words they should use in their speeches to increase or decrease public support for a specific issue. And during elections, exit polls can be used to predict, elections ahead of time. However, some people criticize this and say that the practice of exit polling disincentivizes people from voting. Now, one of the biggest results that we can see from polls across time is that people have generally less faith in the government than they did beforehand. All right, so how does political participation actually work? We can understand how we get the views, but what are we supposed to do with them? Well, it's mainly built off of ideology, which is a set of beliefs on policy or certain issues or morality or values or basically anything. That's what ideology is. Now, there are mainly conservatives and liberals, and groups with clout, cue clout goggles, tend to be conservative, while many minorities and historically oppressed groups tend to be liberal. Now, religiosity is almost always a big determinant whether you are liberal or conservative. But you say, Colin, hey, that doesn't explain, how does political participation work? Well, you have conventional participation, which is going to involve voting, canvassing, which means you go door to door and say, hey, I want you to vote for this person. You have running for office. You can volunteer on campaigns, and that involves a lot of different things. And those are all conventional participation. Now, there's also protest participation and civil disobedience. And so protest is when you say, hey, I'm going to go take to the street and say, I don't like the government. Civil disobedience is when you actually break the law because you believe that the law is unjust. And then sometimes people resort to violence. And these are all be known as unconventional forms of political participation. Now, in political participation, many minorities possess a group consciousness which incentivizes them to vote. And those are the big things to understand. So now we can talk about political parties, because if I have political participation, I need a political party to rely on. So a party is a group of people that are trying to win an election, and it is referred to as a three-headed giant. You have head number one, party in the electorate, right? This is the people that are part of the party. It's a symbolic image. It's a psychological label. It's the ability to identify with a party. However, it's important to note that most people are identifying as independents today. Then you have the party as an organization. This is going to be your national office, your staff, your rules, your bylaws. There's a pyramid shape to it. You have then you have the national committee on the top, you have the states, and then you have the localities. So local parties used to be political machines, right? Think of Boss Tweed, think of John Daly in Chicago. These people would use political patronage and bribes to direct policy. Then you have state parties, which have increased over time, and they have grown in importance in offering technical services to campaigns. And then you have the party and the government, and this is basically what converts the promises of the party platform to policy. Now, while some promises that are made are broken, the vast majority of them are kept. And the platforms that these parties come up with at national conventions serve as blueprints for how these parties should be acting in government. Now, parties have a lot of tasks. They have to pick candidates. They have to run campaigns, and this means coordinating with both the local and state and national level for resources. They give cues to voters. They basically say, what does a candidate believe in based off of a platform? If you see that someone is a Republican, you know that the basic tenets of their belief because they say they are Republican. They are able to articulate policies. This is, again, done through their platform, which they say, these are specific ideas that we're going to be advocating for. And then they coordinate policymaking. Political parties serve as a great bridge between the executive branch, especially the president, and members of Congress. So now that we understand what a party is and what a party does, we should understand the history of political parties, because you're probably going to want to know this for the AP exam. So first, we should understand the years of 1796 to 1824. You're going to have the Federalists as the first party. However, they're going to be gone after 1800 when they lose the election, and they're going to mainly be opposed by the Democratic Republicans. They oppose the Federalists. They have mainly agrarian interests, but they're going to be torn apart by factions around 1824. Then you have the years of 1828 to 1856. So you have the Democrats, which are going to be led by Andrew Jackson. They're mainly a populist party focusing on average Americans. And this is going to be, again, led by Andrew Jackson, but it's going to be run internally by Martin Van Buren. And then you have the main opposition to the Democrats, which is going to be the Whig Party, and that's led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. But the Whig Party is going to get torn apart by their two factions. You have the Southern Planters and the Northern Industrialists. And then you have the years 1860 to 1828. So the next party to rise up is the Republicans. Sorry, not 1828, 1928. You have 1860s to 1928, you have the Republican Party. They're going to take power in 1960 through Abraham Lincoln, and they're going to have they're going to basically enjoy that control over power. And then around the 1890s, you have the second Republican era, in which the Republicans become truly entrenched when they beat Williams Jennings Bryan in the election of 1890. And then until about 1932, and then around 1932, the New Deal coalition takes power. This is going to be made up of urban dwellers, labor unions, Catholics, Jews, the poor, and African Americans. And they're going to hold power from about 1932 to 1964 until around 1964, Nixon engages in the Southern strategy, in which he's able to flip the South from a primarily Democratic institution to a Republican institution, and that's going to basically keep the political landscape of the United States from 1964 on, where the South is the bastion of republicanism and the North serves as a more democratic area. And then lastly, we should discuss third parties. So third parties basically have two roles. They either advocate for specific issues like prohibition, or they offer political extremes, whether it's libertarianism, socialism, Nazism, all these different perhaps terrible ideologies in some cases. They have third parties that represent them. Now, typically, third parties allow more people to enter the electorate by voting for people that they believe in, but they can also create policy which major parties draft because they see that it is popular, right? Whether that's legalization of marijuana from the libertarians, which the Democrats seem to be taking a hold of, or many Green Party policies, which the Democrats seem to be taking a hold of. Policies that third parties put forth can usually be adopted by major parties. So now we can talk about elections themselves. So the first thing to understand is the nomination game, which is the attempt to get the official party endorsement for an election. Now, the goal here is to get the most amount of delegates before the national convention. And up until the 1960s, the delegates that were at these national conventions were typically the party elite. But then in the 1960s, there was a lot of riots and protests over the use of the political elite to determine who became the president or got the presidential endorsement, which leads to the McGovern-Fraser Commission, and they allow rules for open selection of presidential delegate or presidential nominee delegates for national conventions, but superdelegates still exist within the Democratic Party. And the main way to get delegates are through caucuses and primaries. So a caucus is when a group of people decide to come together and say, all right, I like this candidate the most, we're going to give them their electoral votes. And this first caucus is in Iowa, and it's the most important, one of the most important political events in the United States, because if you win or lose the Iowa caucus, it can usually determine the amount of steam that your presidential campaign has. And then you have primaries, is when you actually go to the polls and vote for people. Now, the first primary is in New Hampshire, and just like in Iowa, winning or losing the New Hampshire primary can determine the amount of steam that your political campaign has. Now, many states are going to front load their caucuses and primaries in order to gain media attention, which then leads races down the road, whether it's a caucus or a primary, to already be determined because all these states have front loaded their caucuses and primaries. And then that leads to one of the many criticisms of the system, which is that there's a disproportionate coverage, there's difficulty in running, there's low participation, there's too much money involved, and that the amount of power that the media has. And all these criticisms have undermined the faith that people have in both the caucus and primary system. Now, once you have delegates, you need to have a national convention. So there's 4 days to a national convention. The first day, you're going to have the keynote speaker, and they're going to basically rev everybody up. The second day, you're going to have the party platform, and this is when groups are going to fight over what a party is going to put forth as its policy. And on the third day, you have the selection of the nominee. On the fourth day, you have the selection of the VP nominee, and you have the speech by the presidential candidate to kind of wrap up the national convention. And those are the big 4 days in a party in which they kind of all come together and say, all right, we're going to support this candidate, we're going to support these policies. This is the direction we want to take. So now that you've been nominated, you have to run a campaign. So to reach voters, you have different avenues. You have television and websites, which have increased the ability to reach particular voters over time, but then also using the internet to raise money. This is something that has kind of taken hold more recently, but the internet has allowed for more targeted advertising and more targeted media in order to increase the amount of money that come into presidential campaigns. And then you have the advertising budget, which goes into the media coverage issue. So not only can you reach through, going and actually campaigning at a certain location, but you can also have media coverage. Now, you have two types of media coverage. You have advertising, which is when you actually pay to be put during a commercial break on news programming, or you have free attention by the media. And because you can have free attention, this leads to heavy calculation by communications departments and campaigns that says, how can we maximize the amount of attention that we get for this certain event. Now you need to organize a campaign. What do you have to have a good campaign? You have to have a campaign manager, a fundraiser, counsel, consultants, research staff, pollster, press secretary, a website, and most importantly, the most important thing you need to have a successful campaign, you need to have a good logo. Oh yeah, and there's money, so let's talk about that. The 1974 federal election campaign creates the FEC. It creates the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, which basically allows for a $3 checkbox on your federal tax returns that basically goes towards publicly funded campaigns. Public financing for both primaries and general elections. However, the primary public financing is only about half of what you would get, but it's full financing for a general election, and you have full disclosure about where your money comes from and limits on contributions. However, it's also important to understand the McCain-Feingold Act, because they're going to get rid of the soft money loophole that existed in the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Reform Act. What is soft money, you may be asking? It's when you allow money to be used for party building expenses. So there's something we're forgetting about here is PACs, because the 1974 federal election reform is actually going to create the avenue for PACs to take place. Now you have a 527 group, and this can be an independent group that's not subject to donation limits, or you have a 501c3 group. And these are groups that are exempted from reporting contributions, and they can receive unlimited donations. However, they can only use 50% of the money that they take in for political activity. Now, the biggest thing to understand is that PACs are proliferating in the United States. Now, let's go back to campaigns, because I know we went on that tangent about money, because we got to talk about the impacts of campaigns. We have reinforcement of preferences, you have activism, and you have conversion. So reinforcement of preferences. If I vote for someone, I typically will vote for them again because I actually like them. Activism, which is people are mobilized to go to the polls, they're mobilized to volunteer, they're mobilized to take and advocate for issues that they care about. And then you have conversion, which is changing minds through elections, and this really doesn't happen that often. But all of these impacts can be diminished by issues like selective perception, party identification, and again, going back to that issue we talked about in the Congress section of this video, incumbency. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about some more history. The election of 1800 was the first transition of power. So basically, this election ties in the Electoral College, so it goes to the House of Representatives, and Jefferson is chosen as the president. Then you have the election of 1886, and this is the biggest, economically interested election. You had issues over the gold standard and issues over high tariffs. The Democrats supported William Jennings Bryan, but eventually William McKinley wins that election. And you have the 2008 election. This is when President Barack Obama beat Senator John McCain, and the 2008 financial crisis is what propelled Barack Obama to beat John McCain. And as you can see, economic issues are very big determinants in when and how people vote, and that's probably one of the big things to understand for the AP exam. So now that we understand elections we can talk about voting. So for many citizens, voting is very costly, even though federal laws have expanded suffrage. So even though more people can vote than ever, less people are voting than ever because it's very difficult to vote in the first place. You have to register to vote, but sometimes in southern states, especially North Carolina, they make it very difficult to actually register, which then disincentivizes people from voting. So the question remains, who is voting in the United States? Well, there's a couple of things that make you more likely to vote. If you're more educated, you're more likely to vote. If you're older, you're more likely to vote. If you're married, you're more likely to vote. If you're a woman, you're more likely to vote. And if you are a government employee, you're more likely to vote. So now that we understand who votes, how do people vote? Well, typically they vote based on party identification, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a Libertarian or a Green or whatever you are. Candidate evaluations, which is basically when I look at a candidate, I say, have they done something good for me? Right? Do I believe in them? Do I trust them? That's a candidate evaluation, right? If we look at Scott Taylor, we evaluated him to be a corrupt person, something that we couldn't trust because of his election scandal, so therefore we did not vote for him again. Or you can look at policy voting, which is how did my current congressperson vote on a specific issue, and that's how you're going to vote. I need this certain policy passed, I'm going to vote for the person that supports it. And then the last leg of elections is the Electoral College. So understand that representatives from the states are elected when you have a presidential election. You're not directly voting for the president, you're voting for someone to represent your views in the Electoral College. So in December, they all meet together and they actually vote on the president and the vice president, and that determines the winner. So, we're on the home stretch, ladies and gentlemen. Rights and civil liberties. So, originally the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, but it was incorporated to the states in 1925 through the case of Gitlow v. New York. So let's talk about those civil liberties that we have. The freedom of religion, we have the Establishment Clause, which basically says government is not going to recognize an official religion. The Lemon Test was applied especially when it comes to schools. So basically, legislation has to have a secular purpose. It can neither advance nor inhibit religion, and it cannot lead to excessive government entanglement in religion. However, even though we have the limit test, which curtails government involvement in religious schools, the courts have upheld the fact that public funds can be used to build buildings at religious universities. The court generally does not believe that there has to be an absolute wall between the government and religion, but there cannot be hostility or open endorsement, and that there must be accommodations to all religions. And that's what you need to understand about the Establishment Clause. And then we have the Free Exercise Clause, which basically says, I can practice my religion however I want, but the court actually says, psych, you can't. Because unless a law is targeting religion, or it's targeting a behavior because it is religious, the courts have upheld that you can apply laws to activities that would be considered religious, whether it's polygamy or drug use or something like that. The courts have basically said that even though that's part of your exercise of your religion, because the laws that have been passed are not directly targeting that specific practice, you can apply the law there and inhibit your religious practice there. Now we have freedom of expression. So prior restraint is basically when the government prevents materials from being published. Newspapers have been protected by this, and the courts recognize that it can be done in the name of national security, but they're reluctant to actually grant government requests to restrict publications. Then you have public order. So basically, the government can restrict speech if it has a clear and present danger to society, right? You can't stand up and yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Then courts have said that it's permissible to advocate for the government overthrow or violence in the abstract. Go to Brandenburg v. Ohio. Basically, I can't directly advocate that someone get hurt, but if I'm arguing in the abstract, it's allowed by the courts. Then you have obscenity. Now, obscenity is never protected by the Constitution, and there's a test to figure out if it is obscene or not, and this was established in Miller v. California. If a content applies to prurient sexual interests, is patently offensive, and lacks serious literary, scientific, or artistic or political value, then it is probably obscene. I'll give you some examples of things that are considered obscene by the courts. Masturbation, excretory functions, and lewd expeditions of genitalia are all things that are considered to be obscene by the courts and not protected by the Constitution. Then you have the issues of libel and slander, which are libel is written and slander is spoken. Now, public officials have a higher standard to prove something is libel, and individuals have lower standards. The courts have basically allowed for intense parody, extreme parody, in the case of like Jerry Falwell. So it's very hard to actually prove that something is libel, even though libel and slander are not protected by the First Amendment. Then you have the issue of symbolic speech. Now, symbolic speech is basically the idea that the right to free speech goes beyond simply the spoken word. It applies to actions too, but this doctrine is imprecise. Like, we know we can burn the flag, but to what extent can we do other actions that would be considered symbolic speech? And then you have the press and trials. So one of the things to understand is that the freedom of the press is almost never restricted in the interest of a fair trial. Now, sometimes you can have restrictions on the press, but for the most part, all trials are open to the press to be reported. Then you have commercial speech. Now, understand that law can restrict commercial speech, but courts have gradually expanded that over time. Did you know that it wasn't until like the 1980s or 1970s that lawyers could have billboards and everything, but now you see them all over the place? That's due to an expansion of your commercial speech rights. Now, eventually what the court has done is they equivalent money as speech in the realm of commercial speech, and this is what's going to allow for decisions like Citizens United v. FEC, which we'll get to later on in the video. And then we have to deal with public airwaves. So basically, you go to the FCC and say, I want a license to go on the airwaves because the FCC has strong ability to regulate programming, and it's more regulated than the press because it is more accessible. All right, so now that covers all the issues of freedom of expression. We can talk about freedom of assembly and the right to assemble. That basically means that you can parade, you can picket, you can protest, and localities can regulate these things through permits, and the courts have upheld residential privacy, which means I can't assemble within someone's residency if they don't want me to, but for the most part, the courts have allowed people to assemble and protest and voice their views however they see fit. And then there's the right to associate as part of the freedom of assembly, and this basically allows people to create groups based on a common interest. And these groups have privacy because the courts have basically said you can't just request membership lists to basically hunt down people of a group that you don't support. Now we can talk about the right to bear arms, which is the Second Amendment. Typically, the Second Amendment allows you to hold weapons for the purpose of serving in a militia, but the Heller decision in 2008 by the Supreme Court basically said that you can own a firearm that is not just limited to the purpose of serving a militia. You can have it for self-defense. Now we can talk about defendant rights. So these are not clearly defined, and they're extended to the states on a case-by-case basis through selective incorporation. Now we can talk about search and seizure. Now you need probable cause, which means I have a good reason that I want to search your house. The Fourth Amendment basically forbids unreasonable searches and seizures, but courts will allow police officers to enter if there's an immediate threat to life or a threat to the officer to conduct a search. Now, courts have upheld aerial searches to secure evidence, as well as hot pursuit and stop and frisk. These are all extenuating circumstances in which you can't go get a warrant from the court to do a search, and so it's necessary for these officers to search. However, let's say that I got evidence illegally and it was not one of these extenuating circumstances. The exclusionary rule would prevent a prosecutor from taking that evidence and entering it into the record to be used against me in a trial. Now, one of the things to understand is that as far as the exclusionary rule is concerned, you cannot search a car for evidence of other crimes, right? I can't just pull a car over based on racial bias and then search the car because I believe that there's a crime that's been committed. I need probable cause. And then we can talk about self-incrimination. So the Fifth Amendment prohibits the government from forcing you to incriminate yourself. You have the right to remain silent. And this goes into Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent, what you say can and will be used against you, and that you have a right to have a lawyer present, which factors into the Sixth Amendment, the right to have counsel. Now, public defenders are allowed in capital cases and sentence hearings, and the court applies the Sixth Amendment to all states in the case of Gideon v. Wainwright, which we'll talk about later on down the road. In the sense of trials, 90% of trials end in a plea bargain, but let's say I actually wanted to go to trial. I didn't want to have a plea bargain in which I basically go to the prosecutor and say, I will plead guilty to this crime, and in exchange I will receive a lesser sentence, or I will receive no jail time at all. That's what a plea bargain is. The defendant has a right to a speedy trial and an impartial jury, as well as a public trial, which means there can't be any sort of racial bias on the jury. That's probably one of the biggest aspects of an impartial jury. Then you have cruel and unusual punishment, and this mainly focuses over the Eighth Amendment and the question of the death penalty. In 1972, the courts basically overturned the death penalty and said it was unconstitutional, as well as mandatory death penalty sentences, but those earlier court decisions overturning the death penalty became overturned again by the Supreme Court. Going back to the judiciary part of the video, there are times in which the courts do not observe stare decisis, and the courts have ruled that the death penalty does not violate the Equal Protection Clause, even though in one case it was shown that minority defendants received the death penalty more often than white defendants. Now we can talk about the right to privacy, which is one of the most controversial aspects of the Constitution because it's never actually mentioned in the Constitution specifically. It was created in the case of Griswold v. Connecticut, and it was extrapolated by the court as an unstated liberty. Now, this right to privacy was basically extended in the case of Roe v. Wade to allow the constitutionality of abortion, which creates a lot of controversy. And lastly, we're going to go to civil rights. So there's an emphasis on equal opportunity, not necessarily equal results. The 14th Amendment is what generates the vast majority of equality or protections for equality in the United States with its Equal Protection Clause. And the courts have frowned upon ethnic and racial classifications the most, which basically means that if you have a racial or ethnic classification within a law, you will probably get that overturned. But if it comes to gender classifications, the court only applies intermediate scrutiny, not strict scrutiny, meaning that there's more room to operate within those bounds. So some of the major pieces of legislation passed in the realm of civil rights were the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, all of which help empower blacks, Hispanics, Muslims, and Asians. Women got the 19th Amendment, but still face issues with pay, sexual harassment, and military participation. Seniors and the disabled are protected and have more access to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what about the gays? Well, they still face discrimination, but the courts are starting to rule with them in more favor. And with that, that is all the content that you need to know for the AP government exam. Now we can talk about some cases. Now we can talk about some federal documents. So, the first case is Marbury v. Madison. What did Marbury v. Madison do? It established judicial review. Marbury was like, hey, Madison, give me my pay. I'm going to take you to court. And the court said, hey, first of all, this act is illegal. And second of all, we don't have the right to hear this case. So, basically, Chief Justice was like, all right, now the court has the power to review federal decisions and creates judicial review. Now we have McCulloch v. Maryland. What does McCulloch v. Maryland do? It establishes supremacy over the states and establishes the necessary and proper clause allowing for the government to basically take whatever enumerated powers it has and expand on them as it sees fit, or necessary and proper. Then we have Schenck v. United States. This upholds the clear and present danger test, which basically says that if someone is committing an act of free speech or an act of expression that is a danger to other people or a danger to the United States government has the right to restrict that speech. No longer is it free. Then you have Engel v. Vitale. This basically prohibits school prayer. That's the biggest aspect of that. It's going back to that kind of wall of separation between church and state. Then you have Wisconsin v. Yoder, which upholds the free exercise of religion in the realm of public education because it allowed Mennonites and Amish to take their kids out of school within Wisconsin. You have Tinker v. Des Moines, which upholds freedom of expression in public schools because your rights do not end at the school gate. Symbolic speech was allowed when kids came to school wearing black armbands. So the biggest thing to understand in Tinker v. Des Moines is it upholds student-free speech. However, later cases are going to overturn that, but you don't have to know that for Tinker v. Des Moines. Then we have McDonald v. Chicago, and this case basically incorporates the Second Amendment to the states, and basically says that all of the Second Amendment's protections for the right to bear firearms extend to the states as well, going back to that selective incorporation issue. Then you have the New York Times Code v. United States. This is also known as the Pentagon Papers case. Basically, it strikes down an attempt by President Nixon to exercise prior restraint over the New York Times that they were publishing materials that Nixon had basically said were classified. And so what this case does is it upholds the press's protections against prior restraint. Then you have Citizens United v. FEC, and what this basically does is that it allows interest groups to contribute unlimited amount of money in the form of free speech, or, as I explained earlier, commercial speech. And what the big impact that we're going to see from Citizens United is the proliferation of political action committees. Then you have Baker v. Carr, and this basically enables government intervention in redistricting cases, and basically what the court said is that in a redistricting case, we actually hold the authority to decide over it. And this is going to give the government the ability to make decisions in the case of Shaw v. Reno, in which they basically said that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional because even though it's well-intentioned, it still violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Then we have Brown v. Board of Education, which basically said that separate but equal, which was established in Plessy v. Ferguson, is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment because there's no way that separate facilities could ever actually be equal. And then we have Gidding v. Wainwright, which basically extends the right to have a public defender to the states and basically says that in all cases, all criminal cases, you have the right to have a public defender. And then you have Roe v. Wade, which basically establishes that women have the right to an abortion as a matter of privacy, and they cannot have that right restricted by the government as a matter of privacy, built on by the case of Griswold v. Connecticut. And lastly, we have the case of United States v. Lopez, and that's going to limit the exercise of the Commerce Clause to regulate different activities, because basically what the court said is that the activity which was trying to be regulated in U.S. v. Lopez, which was carrying a gun onto school grounds, was not actually falling under the jurisdiction of the Commerce Clause, and therefore Congress had no right to exercise their authority. Now we have the documents. Federalist 10, factions are bad. That's literally all you need to know about Federalist 10. Factions are bad. Federalist 51, separation of powers good. What you need to know about Federalist 51 is separation of powers is good. Federalist 78 talks about the judiciary and basically explains the importance of life terms and that there's a certain weakness of the judiciary, so there have to be additional protections. Federalist 70 talks about the need for a strong executive to steadfastly administer and run the country. And that's what you need to know about Federalist 70. Brutus 1, also known as an anti-federalist paper, basically warns about the consolidation of power in the national government and that too much power and lack of a good nature of people will actually lead to more harm. That's why power should be given to the states, not to the national government. And lastly, a letter from Birmingham jail, an argument that there must be, that basically MLK's argument that there must be a fight for equal rights, and he also criticizes the hypocrisy of those that were criticizing him for protesting by basically saying, hey, you should be supporting us, not criticizing us. And with that, that is all you need to know for the AP government exam. I hope you pass. I'm Colin Fogarty, signing out. Good luck in your AP government exam.